Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning into another Supatease video. And obviously, PvP has its problems. I think the ongoing complaints about MMR are definitely valid, but I do also think that there are a lot of improvements made to the game and a lot of positive things to talk about in the game as well. So in today's video, I wanted to share some of the community feedback that I have gathered here that is actually positive related to World of Warcraft PvP and their experiences with it so far, and highlighting the improvements and focusing in on what is actually changing and improving moving into the next patch 11.1. And if you want to make sure that you're staying up to date with news related to World of Warcraft, then make sure to hit that subscribe button. Your support is greatly appreciated. So this post comes in from Reddit. It's the hard facts about Blizzard's work on PvP. Remember that the Reddit and forums are a vocal minority of negative opinion holders. Criticism is never constructive, offering reasonable solutions, and wins are never called out. Here are some facts. Which I do think is true. A lot of the positive elements and improvements that have been made to the game, you kind of just like glance over. It becomes just like, this is what I expect. And you kind of forget that those types of things had been done in the past. So here, Blizzard added 2 completely new novel rated game modes over the last 2 expansions that brought over the majority of PvPers and made high rating accessible to different groups of players like BG Blitz and Solo Shuffle. And obviously players for a long time had been requesting solo queue. The clickiness, the gatekeeping of LFG was really preventing a lot of players from being able to even just practice or get good at the game. And I think that's some of the main advantages that these 2 modes have brought into play, is that you can't get gate kept by the community. You queue up, you climb, and you can make your own progress on your own time. And I think we've seen that even represented in the AWC tournaments with a lot of players that have come out of Solo Shuffle, built teams, and taken on some of the biggest names throughout AWC's history, which was not happening very much until frequently. And I do think that these solo queue modes have enabled those types of opportunities. Again, it's not to say that they don't come with their own problems, and finding that sweet spot or finding a new ranking system so players' expectations can actually be met in regards to their own personal climbs, I think is definitely important moving forward. But to say that no improvements have been made, I definitely think is also false. The second point here, PvP has more rewards per season than Mythic Plus. Trust me, on Twitter, whenever there's a PvP reward tweeted, Mythic Plus people are always complaining about what's going on. Why do they get a cool mount? We don't get one. And to be fair, the PvP actually does get a lot. And even while Mythic Plus is their supposed baby, we get 2 mounts. Mythic Plus has only just now started getting a second mount this next patch. We get 2 tier recolors. Mythic Plus has 0. We get a set recolor. We get an enchant as well. And some of them have looked good. Some of them maybe not so much. We also get a tabard. We get unique elite weapon sets and recolors, and obviously a whole plethora of different titles that you can go for. That isn't to say, I also think that Solo Shuffle and BG Blitz should have their own recolors of glad mounts. I don't know how much that costs development time wise, money wise, but I do think like recolors of that season's mount for those modes would absolutely bring participation up. I don't know if their concern is that then participation for 3v3 will continue to diminish downward even further. It's entirely possible. But I think limiting the amount of cool stuff that you can get from modes just because they're really popular to protect another mode is not really the best method either. So I would personally like to see recolored glad mounts for all the modes. Blizzard has made gearing easier every expansion. This expansion weapons were un-RNG'd. Next season you can convert any piece to a PvP tier piece. So this is so PvEers can actually participate. They can use their PvE gear, convert it without having a loss to their PvE gear, and then actually be able to participate in PvP with a similar item level, which is really good for encouraging players to kind of cross-pollinate more so than they were previously. Because if you don't have PvP gear, you just absolutely smashed by people that do have it, which is kind of unfortunate. They removed the PvP stats like PvP power and resilience, but now it's kind of just versatility has taken that role of the PvP stat for most classes. So if you're a PvE and your gear doesn't have versatility, it's not your priority for best in slot, then you're at a real big disadvantage if you ever want to step into PvP. And likely the first time you step into PvP is going to be pretty rough regardless. And then if you're going in there with a gear disadvantage, especially not having versatility, which makes you squishier, you're going to die really fast, and it's just going to exacerbate that issue as far as new players getting in. So I do think that is something that they could look to improve, is maybe adding a PvP stat back, and then when you convert that gear, or figuring out something to make versatility less important in PvP or something like that, so that if you're just jumping in with whatever gear you've got, it's not such a wide variance in terms of your ability to participate in that content. This expansion has already added a new BG and a new arena, and the new BG is simple and fun. And I agree. I think Deep Hall Ravine is honestly my favorite battleground. I really like that it's multiple objectives, a flag in the middle with a cool bonus effect of giving you bloodlust when you cap it, so you're really incentivized to try and get it. You're constantly moving between the carts on each side and trying to think of whether or not you should like backdoor or just front end charge forward, or are you going to spin a base, or how are you going to go about it? And it creates a lot of dynamic gameplay. I think it's honestly their best battleground that they've conceived. New arena, we obviously haven't seen it yet for 11.1. It's kind of looking like a miniature Blade's Edge arena, so hopefully we're not going to get knocked through the floor, but it has very big similarities to Blade's Edge arena. And that map did have some frustrations. Blade's Edge Arena was not all positive things. So I'm a bit curious to see how it plays out, but we are still getting new content, obviously. Blizzard has actively banned toxic players and boosters, even streamers that most people consider untouchable for gaming companies' bottom lines. I don't know if he's talking about some paladins that get very angry with this one, but maybe is what he's looking at. Maybe, I don't know. I feel like the banning is sometimes a little bit over the top. But again, I don't know if the people coming in my chat and telling me I got banned for typing that we need to hit this target or something are lying or not. In a lot of cases, so it's tough to say in that regard. But they're definitely trying their best to stamp out, because you'll see a lot of new players when they step in, when we look at this other post, who are just really afraid of, when they lose, what's going to happen to them, right? So making sure that people understand that, like, that's driving people away from the game. So the reason they're timing you out and they're banning you is because they think that speech is going to drive other players away from the game. So they're just trying to remind people, like, hey, avoid that, because it's going to cause people to leave the game. But obviously false bans and stuff like that, especially if it's super automated, is definitely going to be an issue that I do think needs to be looked at. But they are looking at the issues that players are bringing forward to PvP with doing stuff like this. Blizzard's side project for Downtime Plunderstorm is completely PvP driven, to the point that PvE players complain about it. I think that's the saddest part about WoW, is that we can't just all get along. PvE players hate when PvP gets some cool reward because they just hate it, and then some PvPers hate PvE when they have to do it in order to get gear, and it's just like, I wish that it wasn't like there was no animosity between the parts of the game. It'd be nice if we could all just get along in that sense. But to be fair, they've split this effect, right? Like, they've done the mop remix and whatever else remix likely that's going to be into the future with this Plunderstorm. But obviously, I think it would be very naive for Blizzard to underestimate PvP's value in WoW, considering that their MMORPG has the best MMORPG PvP. So, like, to neglect it or to just completely cast it away in favor of only going all in on PvE, it's kind of like investing for your stocks for the long term. You want to diversify your allocation. It's risky to go all in on one, while their PvE is likely also the best of any other MMORPG. If that ever were to not be the case, at least you still have other things to offer in that category. So I think that it's likely not going to be just like completely thrown away in that regard. If it was, I think it would be pretty naive. The game is relatively balanced. A good player can excel on almost any spec across 30 plus unique specs to play as. I think that's absolutely true. I think the game is probably the most balanced that it's ever been, which is why it's really surprising to see so much negativity towards it. Like, if you go in any PvP YouTubers comment section, it's just people being negative about the game. I don't know if it's just the doomers had their alarm set for the 4th month of an expansion release when the player base normally goes down, and they all just get excited that they get to type their negativity on every single video or in streams and stuff like that. But it's actually in a really good spot if you wanted to play balance wise. Also, MMR is inflating naturally as it does week to week throughout the season, regardless if they manually inflate it themselves. And a lot of my characters are climbing to ranks that are much higher, and I've seen a lot of other players seeing a lot more success as well. So definitely, if you've been wondering, like, is it a good time to jump into the game? If you enjoy the gameplay, it absolutely is. Overall, WoW PvP is in a good place, and we're seeing constantly improvement at the patch level. Things that people actively complained about in the past, like 3's exclusivity and gearing, have been vastly improved. Good job, Blizzard. And then that leads into 11.1, right? 11.1 is seeing improvements as well. They saw the feedback that players are giving that classes are AoEing too much. It's breaking crowd control. So they're bringing in methods to reduce the likelihood that crowd control breaks to these AoE effects. And I think they're also staying on top of the fact that there are other mechanics like Shadow Word Death for priests that manually avoids crowd control by doing damage to themselves and maintaining that interaction, or something like Blessing of Sacrifice for Paladin that redirects damage, doing their best to maintain that interaction and that kind of like outplay value that you get in PvP, while other areas where, a mage's arcane missiles splooged out a little bit of AoE and now the sheep's not going to break just because they happen to move around a little bit. So they're definitely aware of those things, and I think that obviously they want to make sure the classes are fun in PvE. So if doing a bunch of AoE damage is the best way for them to try and balance the classes out in PvE and make PvE a better environment, then I'm not surprised that that's going to be their focus. But they're also aware that, PvPers value crowd control chains and setting up CC, and with all of this AoE available and breaking it, that's going to be a problem. So that's the one big improvement that I'm looking to see for 11.1 is how does that play out? What's the threshold on that damage? And is it going to hit the mark to satisfy the players who have those types of complaints? Now, we've got another player here who played for the first time on his Warlock, and he was surprised that it wasn't toxic and that he actually got advice. He's been having a lot of time on his Arms Warrior. He decided to step into the role of a caster. And it's a lot different. I'll tell you that. I'll tell you that right now. It is a lot different to go from a melee DPS to a ranged DPS, and you suddenly are not the one zugging. You are the one getting zugged. His first lobby, he went 0-6, and he was prepared to instantly block people. But he was actually surprised that he was getting a lot of actual advice on specific circumstances, what to do. So for me, like again, as a Warlock, the number one thing is pay attention to your healers. Your healer CC'd. It's probably a good time to port and run for your life. That's the biggest circumstance that I've seen a lot of times for Warlocks, is that they just don't know when to use their portal, and that's their biggest tool for being able to survive. They'll just kind of press it if they're getting attacked, even if the healer's not CC'd, or they'll just not press it. They'll sit in the middle of the map and they'll take too much damage, and then they'll end up dying. But he was actually surprised that people were actually being helpful. And I feel like, honestly, the most toxicity that you're going to experience in any video game, surprisingly, is not at the bottom of the bell curve, and it's not at the top of the bell curve. It's kind of in the middle. It's in the middle where players are like, they're decent enough to feel entitled that they deserve more, but they're not smart enough to figure out how to get to that next step. So then they're frustrated. They're hard stuck. And then they want to, then it goes out to outsourcing the blame to everybody else. And then it's a self-perpetuating issue where they will never move forward. Most of the toxicity actually ends up coming from like the middle. So if you've ever started out at low rating or played your first lobby, most people probably don't even type. They're just chilling. Most of them are just vibing and they're just pressing their buttons and going at it. And then at the high level, you have some egomaniacs also, but I think it's in the minority. At that top level, it's not to say that it doesn't exist, but it definitely, I think, a smaller volume than the middle. But he actually had a really good time. He played PvP for the first time on the lock, had a really good time climbing up. He was asking for some advice here on the Reddit, and just some positivity, man. Just some positivity. Trying to look at some of the brighter outlooks right now for WoW PvP, because right now it's just very doomer obsessed. So I just wanted to bring some of that forward. And the final post that I saw was a player here who, I did my part. He played every healer to 1800 in solo shuffle. And what I found most interesting about this is that he's a 37-year-old with a 15-month baby at home. So he set some goals for himself in the game. A lot of people say that, like, oh, you can't play WoW, you can't push rating if you've got too many responsibilities, or and I've got some friends who play actively at rank 1 that are active doctors, and even like neurophysicists, and things like that. So this guy stuck it out. He realized that with a kid and with a job and having to move and all this other stuff that he lists out in the story, that he was probably going to have to play a healer because they get the faster queue times. So if you only have an hour or whatever in the evening to play, then you pretty much absolutely have to play a healer if you want to be getting gameplay, which is, again, another issue. I think it would be nice if there was something for like DPS only. It's kind of, I don't know if a double DPS solo shuffle arena mode would actually be fun, or balanced. It definitely wouldn't be balanced, but maybe it would be fun having a double DPS shuffle format, even having a way to queue up 1v1s. Like, we do have the dueling area in Dornegal, in the front area, which is cool. It's got a pillar even. It's next to everything, the vendors and the training dummies. I've actually dueled a few people there while I'm waiting for queue. I don't know if a lot of people realize that. I've seen Venruki had a video and he was reading a post about like having a dueling area, a designated dueling area. Being able to reset your cooldowns would be nice. between duels as like a quality of life improvement, maybe like an NPC or something there in a major city that can reset cooldowns for duels. But you can actually duel there while you're in the queue. But for a lot of people, they just want to, spend time having their rating going up and making progress, right? And everything else is kind of just like a temporary distraction. And the only thing they can really do is either make more healing specs more fun, so more people want to play them. And we can see that with the popularity of something like a Discipline Priest, even though I think Paladin is maybe technically stronger. More people are playing Disc. I think it's just because of the fun elements of Disc is a little bit higher. So focus on making healers more fun so more people want to play them. Also giving healers more impact in the game and say on the outcome of the game. I saw a video from Jack talking about how in Raid people are not bringing healers anymore because you don't need it. The DPS are self-sustainable, and that's kind of usually where healers had their impact, was keeping their team alive. So maybe there's too much personal responsibility on the DPS for their own survival, and maybe that more of that needs to be shifted to the healer's job to keep you alive, as opposed to just you keeping yourself alive, so they have the impact and they have the say in that part of the game. And DPS is more about controlling the enemy healer and executing for kills and executing for wins. That's something that would be way too big to do, obviously, in a patch, and would likely feel bad if you're a DPS spec and you're used to a certain level of self-sustainability. But at the same time, I think it's just something they've been aware of even at the start of the expansion when they lowered healing on some specs. Like Affliction Warlock doesn't just like passively heal itself the whole game. They looked at Shadow Priest healing and brought it down, although Shadow Priest is still healing, is still a little bit higher, bringing down a lot of that DPS self-healing so that healers have more things to do and more control in the content that they're playing, because they're the ones actually controlling whether or not people live or die, as opposed to the only thing mattering is how much DPS does the healer do, or it's just like you're there for an emergency but your main goal is to actually do DPS, which is kind of a weird place for healers to sit. I think having healers main focus, 80-90% healing, and then finding the 10% moments where you can do damage is nice. Maybe 70% healing, 30% damage. Again, it probably depends on what specs. Some specs are more oriented around damage than others, but definitely making healing specs more fun, so people are like, wow, that actually looks really cool, I want to play that. And then also making them have more impact would obviously help with that. But even despite that, he played the healers, he climbed through, he did all the ranks on every single healing spec. He made a fun list. He said Resto Jean was the most fun. Casted Mystery was second. I'm surprised. Resto Druid is third. I'm really surprised he put Disc Priest so low, because I would typically say Prez and Disc end up being some of the most fun with Resto Shaman, and then Holy Paladin and Holy Priest coming in down at the bottom. So interesting to get this perspective from somebody who's playing from like 0 rating to 1800, what they actually consider to be fun. And even though Resto Shaman is probably the weakest healer, or close to the weakest healer at the moment, he still found it to be the most fun. So this is like a case where if you did like a poll and it was like, which healers are the most fun? Okay, if they're fun, then why is no one playing them? Okay, they're too weak, we need to buff them. That's a way that we can fix a healer. But if people are saying a healer is boring, then buffing them is not going to necessarily be the solution to get a lot of people to play them. They obviously need something cooler about them to make them more fun, right? Something just radical, right? Like if you're thinking about Marvel Rivals, you think about like Doctor Strange opens a portal and then sends somebody off of a cliff or something, and it's like, that's something that's just fun. Like it's just, this is a cool effect, a cool ability that just makes this character fun. Then maybe those specs need that type of addition in order to make them better. But obviously, the game can always have improvements. I think it's fair to have criticisms. I have my fair criticisms to it as well. I think MMR being the biggest issue for so long, it definitely needs to be something that's seriously addressed, because I think it is the leading cause for player drop-off and a lack of player retention, is when players feel like they get stuck and they can't move towards the goal that they were trying to get towards, because either MMR is moving too slowly, or in some cases it's too quick and you just get all the rewards right away and then you just stop playing, which is, funnily enough, it feels like Solo Shovel was too slow, BG Blitz was too fast. So BG Blitz participation falls off because everybody immediately got to all their goals and they're just like, well, I guess I got my goals, I'm done. But then Solo Shovel, it's like, oh my god, I'm fighting against gladiators at 2200, what's going on? It's way too hard, I can't get to my goal. And finding that sweet spot with MMR is going to be like the most important thing, I think, aside from gameplay, because they're obviously, I think every patch, they've been looking at gameplay, they acknowledged the feedback from previous patches, they looked and iterated on it, and then this MMR issue just totally negates that. Any sort of like sentiment that players had built up and they're like, I like the game now, is kind of thrown away because MMR got in there. So it's like they're doing so much good, and then it just gets overshadowed because of MMR. So obviously, I would really like them to look at it. But this is just some of the content that I was able to find. I wanted to share with you guys. That's not all negative. I'm still having fun playing. Although I get mad when I get trained on my boom kit and get kicked a lot. There's a lot of fun specs to play at the moment, and I really like the gameplay. And I do think MMR is inflating. And as we're getting closer to the end of the season, obviously, this is probably going to become the best time, actually, if you want to make sure you're getting elite sets, if you're getting these types of transmogs and rewards. But other than that, thank you very much for watching the video. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next one.